Hey guys, tonight we're gonna explore what dating was like in medieval times. This is gonna be an extremely detailed, methodical examination of medieval courtship, marriage arrangements, and romantic interactions that will hopefully help you drift off to sleep. So, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a long, thorough, and decidedly boring journey through medieval romance. To understand what dating was like in medieval times, we must first establish that the modern concept of dating, as we understand it today, did not exist in the medieval period. The idea of two individuals freely choosing to spend time together to determine romantic compatibility, with the possibility of the relationship not leading to marriage, would have been foreign, even scandalous to medieval people. Instead, the process of finding a spouse was governed by family interests, economic considerations, social class boundaries, and religious teachings that emphasize different values than those that guide modern romantic relationships. Let us begin by examining the fundamental differences between medieval courtship and modern dating, as understanding these differences is essential to comprehending why the medieval experience would be so alien and uncomfortable for a modern person. In the modern world, dating is typically initiated by the individuals themselves, who meet through various means including school, work, social activities, or increasingly through digital platforms. The decision to pursue a romantic relationship is made by the two people involved based on mutual attraction, shared interests, and personal compatibility. In medieval times, the process was quite different. For most people, marriages were arranged by families, with the individuals who would actually be married having little or no say in the selection of their spouse. The arrangement of marriages was a business transaction, a way to forge alliances between families, to consolidate property, to improve social standing, or to ensure economic security. Love was not expected to precede marriage, though it might develop after marriage if the couple was fortunate. The idea that personal feelings should be the primary consideration in choosing a spouse would have been seen as foolish and irresponsible. The age at which people married in medieval times varied by social class, region, and time period, but it was generally younger than in modern Western societies, at least for women. Among the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, girls might be betrothed as children and married in their early to mid-teens, often to men who were significantly older. The purpose of these early marriages was to produce heirs and to cement family alliances as quickly as possible. Among the peasantry and working classes, marriage typically occurred later, in the late teens or early 20s, as young people needed time to accumulate enough resources to establish a household. The process of arranging a marriage would typically begin with the families identifying potential matches. For noble families, this might involve negotiations between parents or guardians, sometimes conducted through intermediaries. The discussions would focus on practical matters including dowries, which were payments or property that the bride's family would provide to the groom or to the couple, and dower rights, which were provisions for the wife's support if she was widowed. The personal qualities of the individuals, their preferences, their feelings for each other, these were secondary considerations if they were considered at all. For a young woman of the noble class, the experience would be one of having her future decided by others, typically by her father or male guardian. She would be informed that negotiations were underway for her marriage, and she would be expected to accept the arrangement without complaint. She might meet her intended husband only once or twice before the wedding, perhaps at a formal meeting arranged for the purpose of allowing the families to assess whether the match was suitable. These meetings would be chaperoned and formal, with little opportunity for private conversation or for the young people to express their actual feelings. The young woman would be expected to conduct herself with modesty and decorum at these meetings. She would keep her eyes downcast, speak only when spoken to, and demonstrate the qualities that were valued in a medieval wife, including obedience, piety, and domestic competence. She would not be asked whether she found the proposed husband attractive or whether she liked him. Such considerations were irrelevant. What mattered was whether the match served the interests of the families involved. For a young man, the experience would be somewhat different but still quite constrained by modern standards. A young man of the noble class would have more agency than his female counterpart, but he would still be expected to defer to his family's wishes in matters of marriage. His father or lord would identify suitable matches based on political and economic considerations, and the young man would be expected to agree to the arrangement. Refusing a match that his family had arranged could result in disinheritance or loss of favor, consequences that most young men would not be willing to risk. Among the peasantry and working classes, the process was somewhat less formal but was still shaped by practical considerations rather than romantic feelings. young people would know the other young people in their village or town through community activities, religious observances, and work. They might develop preferences for particular individuals, and these preferences might be taken into account when marriages were arranged. However, parents still played a central role in approving matches and in negotiating the practical arrangements. A peasant family would be concerned with whether a potential son-in-law or daughter-in-law would be a good worker, whether they came from a family with a good reputation, whether they had skills that would benefit the household, and whether the match would improve or at least maintain the family's economic position. The personal attraction between the young people was less important than these practical considerations, though parents might avoid forcing a match if one of the young people had a strong objection. The role of the church in medieval marriage was significant and shaped many aspects of courtship and marriage practices. The Catholic Church, which was the dominant religious institution in medieval Western Europe, taught that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond that could not be dissolved. The Church required that both parties consent to the marriage, at least in theory, though in practice this requirement was often honored more in the breach than in the observance, particularly for women who faced strong pressure to accept the marriages arranged for them. The Church also taught that marriage should be entered into freely, without coercion, and that marriages should not occur between people who were too closely related by blood or marriage. These teachings did provide some limited protection against the most extreme abuses, and occasionally individuals were able to refuse marriages by claiming that they had been coerced or that the proposed spouse was too closely related. However, such refusals were risky and could result in the person being punished or ostracized by their family and community. The process leading up to marriage included several formal steps that were quite different from modern dating practices. After the families had agreed to the match, there would be a formal betrothal, which was a public ceremony in which the couple would exchange promises to marry. This betrothal was legally binding, and breaking it could have serious consequences, including financial penalties and damage to reputation. The betrothal might occur months or even years before the actual marriage, particularly if one or both of the parties was quite young. During the period between betrothal and marriage, the couple would be expected to remain chaste and to avoid any behavior that might compromise the woman's reputation. The woman's virginity was considered essential to her value as a bride, and any suspicion that she had engaged in sexual activity before marriage could result in the marriage being called off, with devastating consequences for the woman and her family. The man also had responsibilities to maintain his reputation and to avoid actions that might bring dishonor to himself or to his future wife's family. Opportunities for the betrothed couple to spend time together would be limited and would always be chaperoned. They might see each other at church services, at family gatherings, or at community events, but they would not be left alone together. The concept of going on dates, of spending time together in private to get to know each other, would not exist. The couple would approach their wedding day as relative strangers, with little knowledge of each other beyond what they had learned from brief, formal interactions and from whatever information their families had shared. This lack of opportunity to develop a relationship before marriage meant that the wedding night was often the first time the couple had any privacy together, and it was the first time they would engage in physical intimacy. For many couples, particularly for young women who had been given minimal information about sexual matters, this would be a frightening and traumatic experience, rather than a romantic one. The expectation that the marriage would be consummated immediately, regardless of the emotional state of the individuals involved, added to the stress and difficulty of the situation. Understanding these fundamental differences between medieval courtship and modern dating is essential to appreciating why the medieval experience would be so uncomfortable and unsatisfying for a modern person. The absence of personal choice, the lack of opportunity to develop emotional intimacy before marriage, the subordination of individual feelings to family interests, the emphasis on property and status rather than on compatibility and affection, all of these would make the medieval courtship process feel cold, transactional, and dehumanizing to someone accustomed to modern ideas about romantic relationships. Chapter 2: The Role of Gender in Courtship. The medieval understanding of gender and the roles assigned to men and women were fundamentally different from modern conceptions, and these differences shaped every aspect of courtship and marriage. To fully comprehend what dating or courtship was like in medieval times, we must examine in detail how gender shaped expectations, opportunities, and experiences. In medieval society, Gender was understood in terms of a strict hierarchy, with men being superior to women in virtually all respects. This was not merely a social custom, but was believed to be the natural and divinely ordained order of things. Religious teachings, medical theories, legal structures, and social practices all reinforced the idea that women were inherently inferior to men and that women's proper role was to be subject to male authority. The Christian Church, which dominated intellectual and spiritual life in medieval Europe, taught that women were morally weaker than men, more susceptible to temptation, and less capable of rational thought. The story of Eve's role in original sin was frequently cited as proof of women's dangerous nature and of the need for women to be controlled by men. Women were viewed with suspicion, seen as potential sources of sin and disorder if not properly supervised and constrained. Medieval medical theory, based on ancient Greek and Roman sources, held that women's bodies were imperfect versions of men's bodies, colder and wetter in their. Women were thought to be ruled by their emotions and their bodies rather than by reason, and this was used to justify their subordinate position in society. These beliefs about gender had profound effects on courtship practices. A young woman approaching marriage age would be seen not as an autonomous individual capable of making her own choices, but as a dependent who needed to be transferred from her father's authority to her husband's authority. Her value lay primarily in her ability to produce legitimate heirs and in whatever property or connections her family could provide through her marriage. Her personal preferences, her desires, her feelings, these were of minimal importance. The emphasis on female chastity was extreme and was central to courtship practices. A woman's sexual purity was considered essential to her worth as a potential wife, and any suspicion of unchastity could render her unmarriageable. This meant that young women were subjected to intense surveillance and restriction of their movements and activities. A young woman of any social standing would rarely be allowed to go anywhere without a chaperone, and her interactions with young men would be carefully monitored. The double standard regarding sexual behavior was stark. While women were expected to remain virgins until marriage and to be faithful within marriage, men faced much less scrutiny. A man's sexual activities before marriage were generally tolerated or even expected, as long as he did not compromise women of his own social class. Men might visit prostitutes or engage in relationships with women of lower social status with relatively little social consequence, though they were still expected to avoid obvious scandal. This double standard created an asymmetry in courtship experiences. A young woman would approach potential marriage with no sexual experience, and often with very little knowledge about sexual matters, as discussing such topics with unmarried women was considered inappropriate. She would be expected to be passive and modest in all interactions with men, never initiating conversation or showing too much interest, as such behavior could be seen as immodest or even wanton. A young man, by contrast, would be expected to take the initiative in courtship, though within the constraints imposed by family arrangements and social conventions. He would be expected to demonstrate qualities including social status, economic prospects, martial prowess, or professional competence, depending on his class, and the ability to protect and provide for a family. His personal feelings about potential matches would be given more weight than a woman's feelings, though his choices would still be constrained by family expectations and social boundaries. The concept of romantic love, as we understand it today, existed in medieval culture, but in a very specific and limited form. The tradition of courtly love, which developed in the late medieval period, particularly in France, and which was celebrated in poetry and literature, portrayed an idealized form of love between a knight and a noble lady. However, this courtly love was typically portrayed as occurring outside of marriage, often as an unconsummated adoration of a married woman by a devoted knight. This literary tradition had little relationship to actual courtship and marriage practices. In reality, expressions of romantic love were generally viewed with suspicion, particularly if they seemed to conflict with family interests or social propriety. A young person who claimed to be in love with someone their family did not approve of would be told that such feelings were foolish and immature, that they would pass, and that duty to family was more important than personal desires. Love was expected to develop after marriage, if at all, as the couple worked together and raised children together. The experience of courtship for a medieval woman would be characterized by passivity and powerlessness. She would wait to be chosen, would have little opportunity to express preferences, would be given minimal information about what to expect in marriage, and would move from her father's household to her husband's household with little agency in the matter. The emphasis would be on her conduct and reputation, on demonstrating the qualities that would make her an acceptable wife, rather than on her developing a relationship with her future husband. For a medieval man, while he would have more power and agency than his female counterpart, he would still face significant constraints. His choice of spouse would be limited by social class boundaries that were rarely crossed. His family's economic interests and social ambitions would shape his options, and the emotional and romantic aspects of the relationship would be subordinated to practical considerations. He would be entering marriage primarily as an economic and social arrangement rather than as a romantic partnership. The roles within marriage were clearly defined by gender. The husband would be Sapor, the head of the household, with legal authority over his wife and 2 children. He would manage the family's economic affairs, represent the family in public and legal matters, and make all major decisions. The wife would manage the household's daily operations, oversee servants if the family had any, bear and raise children, and support her husband's endeavors. She would be expected to be obedient to her husband in all things, as this was both a social expectation, a religious duty. These rigid gender roles meant that courtship was not about finding a compatible partner with whom to build an egalitarian relationship, but rather about finding someone who could fulfill their assigned role in a hierarchical family structure. A man would look for a woman who would be a good household manager and mother, who would bring honor and resources to the family, and who would be obedient and supportive. A woman's preferences mattered little, as she would be expected to adapt to whatever situation her marriage placed her in. The wedding ceremony itself reflected these gender roles. The woman would be given away by her father or male guardian to the groom, symbolizing the transfer of authority over her from one man to another. She would promise to obey her husband, while he would promise to protect and provide for her. The asymmetry of these vows reflected the fundamental inequality of the relationship, an inequality that was considered natural and proper. After marriage, a woman would have even less freedom than she had as a daughter. She would be under her husband's control, and he would have the legal right to discipline her, to control her movements, and to make all decisions for the family. While most marriages likely did not involve extreme abuse, the power imbalance was such that women had little recourse if they were mistreated. Divorce was essentially impossible in Catholic regions, as the Church considered marriage indissoluble, though annulments could sometimes be obtained for specific reasons, including consanguinity or impotence. Understanding the gender dynamics of medieval courtship helps us see why the experience would be so difficult for modern people. The inequality, the lack of agency for women, the emphasis on control and subordination rather than on partnership and mutual respect, all of these would be deeply troubling to anyone with modern sensibilities about gender equality and relationships. A medieval courtship would feel less like the beginning of a romantic relationship and more like a business transaction or a transfer of property, with all the coldness and impersonality that implies. Chapter 3: Social Class and Courtship. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval society had profound effects on courtship and marriage practices, creating boundaries that could rarely be crossed and shaping experiences in ways that would be alien to modern sensibilities. Let us examine how social class affected every aspect of finding a spouse and forming a marriage. Medieval society was divided into distinct social classes that were largely hereditary and that came with specific rights, responsibilities, and restrictions. At the top were the nobility, who owned most of the land and who held political and military power. Below them were knights and lesser nobility. Then came wealthy merchants and prosperous craftsmen in towns and cities. Below them were peasant farmers who made up the vast majority of the population. At the bottom were laborers who owned no land and worked for others, and below even them were serfs who were bound to the land and were not free to leave. These social divisions were not merely economic but were considered to be part of the natural order of society, ordained by God. Each class had its place and its function, and crossing class boundaries was seen as disrupting this divinely established world. In courtship and marriage, this meant that people were expected to marry within their own social class, and marriages that crossed class lines were rare and often problematic. For the nobility, marriage was primarily a political and economic tool. Noble families used marriages to forge alliances, to consolidate territories, to create or strengthen bonds with other powerful families, and to produce legitimate heirs who would inherit titles and lands. The individuals who would actually be living together as husband and wife were almost irrelevant to these larger considerations. Noble marriages were arranged by the heads of families, often with input from advisors and sometimes with the involvement of the monarch. The process of arranging a noble marriage might take months or years of negotiation. The families would discuss the terms of the marriage contract, which would detail the dowry, the dower rights, the inheritance provisions, and various other legal and financial matters. These contracts could be enormously complex, sometimes running to many pages of legal text. The young people who would be married might not meet until the negotiations were far advanced, and they would have no say in the terms being negotiated on their behalf. Noble women were particularly constrained by these arrangements. A noble woman's value lay largely in her ability to create alliances through marriage and to produce legitimate heirs. She might be betrothed as a child to someone she had never met, sometimes to someone in a distant country. She would be raised with the understanding that she would leave her family to marry a stranger and would be expected to adapt to her new circumstances without complaint. Her feelings about the arrangement were simply not relevant. Noble men had somewhat more freedom but were still heavily constrained. A nobleman might refuse a match that his family proposed, but doing so could result in serious consequences, including disinheritance or loss of favor with his lord or king. The pressure to accept the marriages arranged for him would be immense, and most young noblemen would acquiesce to their family's wishes even if they had personal reservations. The age gap between spouses in noble marriages could be significant. It was not uncommon for girls in their early teens to be married to men in their 30s, 40s, or even older. These age differences reflected the political nature of the marriages, as the men chosen as husbands were selected for their power, status, and resources rather than for their compatibility with the young women they were marrying. The young brides would be frightened and overwhelmed, married to men who were strangers and who were old enough to be their fathers. For the merchant and craftsman classes, marriages had different considerations, but was still primarily an economic arrangement. A merchant's daughter would be an attractive match for another merchant or for an aspiring tradesman because she might bring a dowry of money or goods, and because the marriage would create business connections between families. Marriages within these classes were often between families in the same trade or related trades, reinforcing professional networks. The courtship process for merchant and craftsman families would be somewhat less formal than for nobility, but would still be heavily influenced by practical considerations. Parents would identify potential matches among families they knew through business or community connections. Young people might have somewhat more opportunity to express preferences than noble youth, particularly if the family was relatively prosperous and could afford to be flexible. However, the final decision would still rest with the parents, and economic considerations would be paramount. For the peasantry, which made up the vast majority of the medieval population, courtship and marriage had yet different characteristics. Peasant marriages were still arranged by families, but the process was less formal and the legal requirements were simpler. A peasant couple did not need elaborate marriage contracts, though they did need permission from the lord who owned the land they worked, and they might need to pay a fee called a bont merchant for this permission. Peasant young people might have more opportunity to interact with potential spouses than their social betters, as they worked together in the fields and saw each other at community gatherings. They might develop preferences and might communicate these to their parents. However, the decision about whom to marry would still be made primarily by considering practical matters, including whether the potential spouse was a good worker, whether they came from a family with a good reputation, and whether the match would help or harm the family's economic position. The concept of marrying for love, of choosing a spouse based primarily on personal attraction and felt emotional connection, would have been seen as foolish and irresponsible across all social classes. Love was viewed as a pleasant but inessential addition to marriage if it developed, but it was not a prerequisite. The primary purposes of marriage were to produce legitimate children, to manage a household, and to serve the economic and social interests of the families involved. Personal happiness was not a consideration. Social class boundaries in marriage were enforced through social pressure, legal restrictions, and practical obstacles. A nobleman who wished to marry a peasant woman would face opposition from his family, potential disinheritance, and social ostracism. The church might refuse to perform the marriage, or it might require special dispensations. The poor woman would be seen as a fortune hunter trying to rise above her station, and both parties would be subject to gossip and condemnation. Marriages that did cross class lines were usually between adjacent classes and usually involved the lower status person moving up rather than the higher status person moving down. A wealthy merchant's daughter might marry a poor nobleman, bringing her father's money to help restore the nobleman's finances while gaining a title for her family. A prosperous craftsman might marry his daughter to a lesser merchant. These modest upward movements were tolerated, though they were still viewed with some suspicion. The experience of courtship was thus dramatically different depending on one's social class, but in all cases it was shaped more by practical considerations than by emotional or romantic ones. The modern notion that people of any background can fall in love and choose to marry, regardless of social status, family preferences, or economic considerations, would have been incomprehensible to medieval people. Marriage was too important as economic and social institution to be left to the whims of young people in love. Chapter 4. The practicalities of meeting and interaction. Given the constraints we have discussed, including arranged marriages, limited female agency, rigid social hierarchies, and the absence of anything resembling modern dating, the question arises, how did young people in medieval times actually meet potential spouses, and what opportunities existed for interaction before marriage? Let us examine the practical aspects of how young people encountered each other and the limited ways they could interact. For the nobility, opportunities for young people to meet were carefully controlled and were often part of the broader political and social life of the noble class. Young noble women might live at home with their families or might be sent to serve in the household of a more powerful noble family, where they would learn the skills necessary for managing a noble household. This service might last several years and might provide opportunities to meet young noblemen who lived in the household. However, these encounters would always be supervised and formal. A young woman serving in a noble household would not be free to wander about or to engage in casual conversation with young men. Her activities would be overseen by older women who would ensure that her behavior was always proper and modest. Any interaction with young men would occur in public spaces with many people present, and private conversations would be virtually impossible. Noble young men might encounter potential matches at tournaments, which were important social events for the nobility. Tournaments were competitions where knights would demonstrate their martial skills in jousting and other contests. These events would be attended by noble families from the surrounding region, and young people would see each other across the tournament grounds. However, direct interaction would be limited and would require the involvement of family members or intermediaries. Feasts and celebrations at noble households provided another venue for young nobles to see each other. When a powerful lord held a feast, he would invite other noble families from his region, and young people would attend these events with their families. The seating at such feasts would be arranged by rank and by family, so young people would not be seated near potential matches unless their families had already arranged for them to meet. The atmosphere would be formal and public, with little opportunity for private conversation. For merchant and craftsman families, young people might meet at market fairs, at guild celebrations, or at religious festivals. Market fairs were important economic and social events where merchants from different towns would gather to buy and sell goods. Families would attend these fairs together, and young people would see the sons and daughters of other merchant families. However, they would be with their families and would be expected to help with business rather than to socialize with potential romantic interests. Guild celebrations, which marked religious feast days or important events for Bulsimo, the guild, would bring together families involved in a particular trade. These celebrations might include feasts, processions, and other festivities, and young people would attend with their families. The guild context meant that young people would be meeting others from similar economic and social backgrounds, which was considered appropriate. However, the events would be communal rather than providing opportunities for private interaction. Religious observances provided some other most common opportunities for young people to see each other. Everyone, regardless of social class, was expected to attend church services regularly, typically on Sundays and on important religious festivals. Church was one of the few places where the entire community would gather, and young people would see each other there. However, the setting was not conducive to conversation or interaction. People would be focused on worship, and talking during services would be considered disrespectful and inappropriate. After church services, there might be some limited opportunity for families to greet each other and for young people to be briefly introduced. However, these interactions would be brief and formal, with parents present and young people expected to be on their best behavior. A young woman would not be allowed to linger talking to a young man, as this would be seen as forward and immodest. Any conversation would be superficial and carefully observed. For peasant communities, young people would have more opportunity for interaction simply because they worked together. The agricultural cycle required the labor of the entire community, and young people would work alongside each other in the fields during planting and harvest. They would see each other at community work parties, where villagers would gather to help complete large tasks such as building a barn or repairing a road. These work settings would provide opportunities for young people to observe each other and to form opinions about who would make a good spouse. A young man might notice that a particular young woman was a hard worker and was skilled at the tasks required of a farmer's wife. A young woman might observe which young men were strong and capable and which seemed likely to be good providers. However, even in these relatively informal settings, behavior would be constrained by community norms and by the presence of parents and other adults who would monitor interactions. Village dances and celebrations would provide rare opportunities for young people to interact in a somewhat more relaxed atmosphere. On certain feast days, the village might hold a celebration that included music and dancing. Young people would dance together in groups, with the dances being folk dances that involved multiple couples or groups rather than intimate partner dances. These occasions would be boisterous and would be supervised by the community, with older people present to ensure that behavior remained appropriate. However, even these celebrations had limits. A pure young woman who danced too much with one particular young man, or who seemed too enthusiastic or flirtatious, would be criticized and would damage her reputation. Young people needed to balance enjoying the celebration with maintaining proper decorum. Any romance that developed would need to be subtle and would need to be communicated through glances and small gestures rather than through direct conversation or physical contact. The practice of bundling, which existed in some regions and time periods, provided a controversial and limited form of interaction between courting couples. Bundling involved a courting couple being allowed to lie in bed together, fully clothed, and sometimes with a board between them under the supervision of the young woman's family. The couple could talk privately while still being technically chaperoned. This practice was viewed with suspicion by religious authorities and was not universally practiced, and it was certainly not an opportunity for physical intimacy. Letter writing, for those who were literate, could provide a means of communication between potential spouses, though this was limited to the educated classes and was subject to oversight. A young man might write to a young woman's father requesting permission to court her, and if permission was granted, he might be allowed to write to her. However, these letters would often be read by parents or guardians, and they would need to be formal and proper in tone. Love letters, as we understand them, expressing deep emotion and personal feelings, would be risky as they could be seen as inappropriate. The Pownell picture is one of severely limited opportunities for young people to interact before marriage, particularly for women. A young woman might see her future husband only a handful of times before the wedding, and they might never have a private conversation. She would go into marriage as a stranger to her husband, knowing little about his personality, his temperament, or his character beyond what she could observe in brief, formal interactions and what her family had been told. This lack of opportunity to develop a relationship before marriage meant that the early period of marriage was a time of difficult adjustment. The couple would need to learn to live together and to develop some form of workable relationship despite having had no chance to determine compatibility beforehand. Some couples would develop affection and even love over time. Others would remain essentially strangers living under the same roof, bound together by legal and social obligations but never developing emotional closeness. For a modern person, this system would be intolerable. The inability to choose one's own spouse, the lack of opportunity to get to know potential partners, the absence of privacy and personal freedom in interactions, all of these would make the medieval courtship experience feel oppressive and dehumanizing. The idea that you would marry someone you barely knew, with no assurance of compatibility or even basic personality fit, would be terrifying. Yet this was the normal experience for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, and they accepted it because they had never known anything different and because the social and economic structures of their world made alternatives unthinkable. Chapter 5: The Wedding and its Aftermath. After the prolonged process of negotiation and the limited interactions between the betrothed couple, the wedding would finally take place. The wedding ceremony and the immediate aftermath would be the culmination of the courtship process and would mark the beginning of married life. Let us examine what this transition would be like and why it would be so difficult for a modern person to endure. The wedding ceremony itself varied somewhat by region, time period, and social class, but certain elements were common throughout medieval Christian Europe. The ceremony would take place at the church door, not inside the church, as the public nature of the exchange of vows was considered important. The couple would stand before the priest and before witnesses from the community, and they would exchange vows in which they promised to take each other as husband and wife. The bride would be given away by her father or male guardian, symbolizing the transfer of authority over her from her birth family to her husband. She would be wearing her best clothing, which might be a new dress if the family could afford it, or simply her everyday clothing, cleaned and repaired. Wealthy brides might wear elaborate gowns, but the white wedding dress would not become standard until much later. The color of the dress was less important than the fact that it was the best the family could provide. The groom would also wear his best clothing and would provide a ring for the bride. The ring was a symbol of the marriage contract and demonstrated the groom's commitment and his ability to provide for his wife. The exchange of rings would be accompanied by specific words prescribed by the church, and getting these words correct was important for the validity of the ceremony. After the exchange of vows at the church door, the couple and the witnesses would enter the church for a nuptial mass. This mass would include prayers for the couple, readings from scripture, and blessings. The couple would kneel before the altar, and the priest would bless them and pray for the fruitfulness of their union. The emphasis would be on the religious and social aspects of marriage rather than on the romantic or emotional aspects. Following the church ceremony, there would be a feast, the elaborateness of which would depend on the wealth of the families involved. For noble families, the wedding feast might be a lavish affair lasting for days, with many courses of food, entertainment, including musicians and performers, and attendance by many guests from noble families across the region. For peasant families, the feast might be a simple meal shared with the immediate community, featuring whatever food the family could afford or that neighbors contributed. At these feasts there would be much drinking and celebrating, and the atmosphere could become quite rowdy. The guests would toast the couple repeatedly, and there would be crude jokes and comments about the wedding night and the couple's future sexual relationship. For the bride, who might be a young teenager, this public attention to her impending loss of virginity would be mortifying and frightening. The groom, too, might be uncomfortable with the public scrutiny, though the joint emphasis would be on his anticipated performance rather than on his vulnerability. As the feast wound down, often late in the evening, the couple would be escorted to the bridal chamber. This escort might involve a public procession of guests accompanying the couple to the bedroom, with continued joking and commentary. In some traditions, guests might witness the couple getting into bed together, though they would typically leave before the actual consummation. In other traditions, the guests might remain outside the door, waiting to hear evidence that the marriage had been consummated. The expectation that the marriage would be consummated on the wedding night was strong, as consummation was necessary for the marriage to be fully valid in the eyes of the church and the law. For the bride, who might have received little or no information about sexual matters, the wedding night could be traumatic. She would be expected to submit to her husband, whom she might have met only a few times, in an act that she did not fully understand and that might be painful and frightening. For the groom, the pressure to perform would be significant. He would be expected to assert his husbandly rights immediately, to demonstrate his virility, and to begin the process of producing heirs. If he was unable to perform, whether due to inexperience, nervousness, or excessive drinking at the feast, this could be seen as a failure of manhood and could even be grounds for annulling the marriage if the situation persisted. The emphasis on the bride's virginity meant that evidence of consummation was sometimes displayed publicly. In some traditions, the blood-stained sheets from the wedding night would be shown to family members or even displayed publicly to prove that the bride had been a virgin. This invasion of privacy would be deeply humiliating for the bride, but it was considered necessary to protect the honor of both families and to ensure that there could be no later questions about the legitimacy of any children born to the couple. In the days and weeks following the wedding, the couple would begin the process of establishing their household and learning to live together. For the bride, this meant leaving her family and moving into her husband's household, which might be in a different village or even a different region. She would be separated from everything familiar and would need to adapt to new surroundings, new people, and new expectations. She would be under the authority of her husband, and, if they lived with his family, also under the authority of her mother-in-law. The relationship between a new bride and her mother-in-law could be difficult, as the older woman might resent the newcomer and might criticize her work or her behavior. The bride would need to prove herself capable of managing household tasks and of bearing children, and any failings would be noted and commented upon. The pressure to conform to the expectations of her new family would be intense. The husband would face his own adjustments, though these would typically be less dramatic than what his wife experienced. He would be expected to establish himself as head of his household, to provide for his wife, and to begin producing children. The success of the marriage would be judged primarily by whether the wife became pregnant quickly and whether she bore healthy children, particularly sons. If the wife did not become pregnant within the first year or two of marriage, this would be seen as a serious problem and would reflect badly on her, as fertility was assumed to be primarily a female attribute, and problems with conception were usually blamed on the woman. The wife might be subjected to various folk remedies and treatments intended to increase fertility, some of which would be uncomfortable or even dangerous. The pressure to conceive would be constant and would create significant stress. The emotional adjustment to married life would be challenging for both spouses, but particularly for the wife. She would be living with someone she barely knew, someone who had authority over her, and someone who would expect sexual relations, whether or not she desired them. The concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law or culture. A parent had the right to sexual access to his wife, and she was obligated to submit. If she resisted, he could use force, and this would not be seen as wrong. Over time, some couples would develop affection for each other and would build functional partnerships. They would learn each other's habits and temperaments, would work together to manage their household, and would bond through the shared experience of raising children. In the best cases, genuine love might develop and the couple might become true companions. However, this was not guaranteed, and many marriages remained cold arrangements of convenience where the spouses fulfilled their prescribed roles but never developed emotional intimacy. In the worst cases, marriages could be characterized by abuse, neglect, and misery. An abusive husband could beat his wife, control her every move, and make her life a living hell, and she would have little recourse. Divorce was essentially impossible in Catholic regions, and even separations were difficult to obtain. A woman trapped in an abusive marriage would simply have to endure, perhaps finding some solace in her children or in her faith, but knowing that her situation would not change. For a modern person, the entire process from courtship, through wedding, and into the early periods, marriage would be nightmarish. The joint lack of choice, the absence of emotional connection before marriage, the public scrutiny and humiliation surrounding the wedding night, the pressure to conform to rigid gender roles, the possibility of ending up in an unhappy or abusive marriage with no escape, all of these would make the medieval experience of marriage feel like a trap rather than a celebration of love and commitment. Chapter 6: Alternatives to Marriage and Their Consequences. While marriage was the expected path for most people in medieval society, there were alternatives, though these alternatives came with significant social, economic, and personal costs. Understanding these alternatives helps illuminate why marriage, despite its constraints and difficulties, was still the preferred option for most people. Let us examine what happened to those who did not marry and why avoiding marriage would be so difficult. For women, the primary alternative to marriage was entering religious life by becoming a nun. Convents provided one of the few socially acceptable paths for women who did not marry, whether by choice or by circumstance. A woman who entered a convent would take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating her life to prayer and to the service of the church. In exchange, she would have a secure place to live, would be provided with food and shelter by the convent, and would be part of a community of women. However, entering a convent was not simply a matter of personal choice. It required a dowry, much like marriage, as the convent needed financial support for each new member. This meant that becoming a nun was not an option for poor women, whose families could not afford the required payment. Additionally, convents had limited space and could not accept all who wished to enter, so there might be waiting lists or requirements that needed to be met. Life in a convent was highly regimented and austere. Nuns would follow a strict daily schedule of prayer, work, and study. They would wear simple habits, eat plain food, and sleep in sparse accommodations. Their contact with the outside world would be limited, and they would be expected to renounce worldly pleasures and concerns. For some women, this life provided meaning and community, but for others, particularly those who entered convent not from religious calling, but because they had no other options, it could be confining and unfulfilling. For men, entering religious life as a monk or priest was also an alternative to marriage. Like convents for women, monasteries provided a structured life dedicated to religious service. Monks would take similar vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they would follow strict rules governing their daily lives. Men who entered the priesthood would serve in parishes, celebrating Mass, administering sacraments, and providing spiritual guidance to their communities. However, becoming a monk or priest also required resources. A family would need to provide support for a son's education in piety, preparation for religious life, and monasteries might require endowments. Additionally, not all men had a genuine religious calling, and entering religious life without true dedication could lead to unhappiness and piety to violations of the vows taken. For women who did not marry and who did not or could not enter a convent, the options were very limited and often quite difficult. An unmarried woman who remained in her father's household would be in an ambiguous social position, neither child nor independent adult. She would be expected to help with household tasks and might serve as a caretaker for aging parents or as a helper in raising her siblings' children. However, she would have no household of her own and would remain under her father's authority, or after his death, under the authority of her brothers. Such women would be pitied and might be mocked as spinsters or old maids, even if they were relatively young. Their unmarried status would be seen as a failure, either because they lacked the attractiveness or dowry to secure a husband, or because something was wrong with them that made them unmarriageable. The social stigma attached to unmarried women would make their joint lives uncomfortable, and they would be marginalized in a society that defined women primarily by their roles as wives and mothers. Women without family support who did not marry faced even grimmer prospects. They might work as servants in other people's households, receiving minimal wages and being subject to the authority and potential abuse of their employers. They might work in low-status occupations such as laundry or spinning, earning barely enough to survive. In the worst cases, women without other options might turn to prostitution, which was illegal and sinful, but which provided income when no other work was available. For men, remaining unmarried was somewhat more socially acceptable, though it was still unusual and would invite questions and speculation. An unmarried man might be suspected of having a secret vice or of being unable to afford a wife. However, men had more options for independent life than women did. A man could work at a trade, could travel, could join the military or become a mercenary, or could pursue various occupations that did not require being married. The social pressure to marry was strong for men as well as for women, but for different reasons. For men, marriage was seen as a sign of maturity and of becoming a full member of the community. A man who remained unmarried into his 30s or beyond would be seen as not having fully assumed adult responsibilities. However, the consequences for men who did not marry were less severe than for women, as men's social standing was not as dependent on marital status. One alternative that some people pursued was informal, common law relationships that were not officially sanctioned by marriage. Couples might live together and function as husband and wife without having gone through an official marriage ceremony. This might occur because they could not afford the costs associated with marriage, because one or both of them was already married to someone else, or because they wanted to avoid the legal and social commitments of marriage. However, such relationships were viewed with disapproval by both the church and by society. Children born to unmarried parents were considered illegitimate and faced legal disabilities, including being unable to inherit property in many cases. The woman in such a relationship would have no legal protections and could be abandoned by the man with no recourse. These relationships were precarious and were not seen as respectable alternatives to proper marriage. Homosexual relationships, while they certainly existed in medieval society, were completely unacceptable and were condemned by the church as sinful and by the law as criminal. People who engaged in homosexual acts faced severe punishments if discovered, including public humiliation, fines, imprisonment, or even execution in some cases. The daunt requirement to marry and to conform to heterosexual norms was thus even stronger for those whose inclinations did not align with social expectations, and many people were forced into marriages that were fundamentally incompatible with their actual desires. The strong social pressure to marry, the limited alternatives, and the severe consequences for those who did not conform to marital expectations all combined to make marriage nearly universal in medieval society. Almost everyone married, often by their early 20s, if not sooner, because the alternatives were simply too difficult or too stigmatized to be viable options. This meant that even people who might have been happier remaining single or who might have preferred different life paths were funneled into marriage whether or not it suited them. Understanding these alternatives and their limitations helps us appreciate why the medieval system of arranged marriages persisted despite the unhappiness it might cause for individuals. Marriage was not just a personal choice, but was a social and economic necessity, the foundation upon which households were built and through which society reproduced itself. Opting out of marriage meant opting out of normal social life, and few people were willing or able to accept that consequence. For a modern person, the lack of real alternatives to marriage would be another oppressive aspect of medieval life. The inability to simply choose to remain single and independent, to pursue a career or a calling without needing to marry, to live according to one's own preferences and inclinations. All of these freedoms that modern people take for granted would be absent. You would marry because you had to, not because you wanted to, and you would do so, knowing that the marriage would likely be arranged without much regard for your personal happiness or compatibility with your spouse. Chapter 7. The Reality of Medieval Romance. Having examined the practical, social, and institutional aspects of medieval courtship and marriage, we must now address the question of whether romance, as we understand it, existed at all in medieval times, and, if so, what form it took. The answer is complex and helps illustrate the vast gulf between medieval and modern understandings of love and relationships. Romantic love did exist as a concept in medieval culture, but it was quite different from modern romantic love. The tradition of courtly love, which developed in the late medieval period, particularly in the courts of southern France, celebrated a form of refined, idealized love that was the subject of poetry, songs, and stories. However, this courtly love tradition had little relationship to actual marriage practices and indeed often portrayed love as existing outside of or even in opposition to marriage. In courtly love literature, a knight would dedicate himself to a noble lady, typically a married woman of higher social status than himself. He would perform deeds of valor in her honor, would write poems celebrating her beauty and virtue, and would suffer nobly from his unrequited love. The lady would be distant and unattainable, and the knight's love would be pure and spiritual rather than physical. This love was portrayed as ennobling the knight and inspiring him to greater achievements. However, this literary tradition bore little resemblance to real relationships. Courtly love was a game played in aristocratic courts, a form of entertainment and social ritual that operated according to specific rules and conventions. It was understood to be separate from the serious business of marriage and family life. A nobleman might write love poetry to a lady at court while being married to someone else and while fully expecting the lady to remain faithful to her husband. The gap between courtly love literature and lived experience was enormous. Real marriages, as we have discussed, were arranged for practical reasons and were not expected to be based on romantic love. The idea that one might fall desperately in love with someone and might suffer from unrequited passion was the stuff of poetry and stories, not something that was expected to occur in real life or that was seen as a desirable basis for marriage. When genuine romantic attraction did develop between people who were not married to each other, it created problems rather than being celebrated. Adultery was a serious sin and could result in severe punishment, particularly for women. A married woman who was caught in an adulterous relationship could face public humiliation, physical punishment, or even death, depending on the circumstances and the customs of the region. Her male lover might also face punishment, though typically less severe than what the woman would suffer. The emphasis on female chastity meant that any expression of romantic or sexual interest by a woman was dangerous to her reputation. A woman who showed too much interest in a man, who seemed too eager or too passionate, would be suspected of wantonness and would damage her marriage prospects. Women needed to be passive and modest, allowing men to initiate, and to demonstrate interest, while carefully controlling their own responses. For men, expressing romantic interest was more socially acceptable, but it still needed to be done within appropriate boundaries. A man who became obsessed with a woman who was not available to him, who pursued her despite her being married or betrothed to another, or who allowed his passion to interfere with his duties and responsibilities, would be seen as foolish and would lose respect. Romantic love was acceptable as a literary theme or as a moderate emotion that developed within marriage, but not as an overwhelming passion that disrupted social order. The concept of dying for love, which appears in some medieval literature and legends, was seen as tragic and foolish rather than as noble or admirable in real life. The story of Romeo and Juliet, written later but based on medieval Italian sources, portrays the lover's passion as leading to disaster. The moral of such stories was often that following one's romantic passions rather than accepting the marriages arranged by one's family led to tragedy and death. Within marriage, the development of affection and even love was certainly possible and was even encouraged to some extent. Religious teachings suggested that husbands and wives should develop mutual respect and affection, should work together harmoniously, and should support each other. A good marriage was one where the spouses fulfilled their duties to each other and where they developed a workable partnership. If genuine fondness or love developed, this was seen as a blessing, but not as a requirement. Many married couples probably did develop genuine affection for each other over time, shared experiences, including the birth and raising of children, the management of a household, the bond, survival of hardships together, all of Einte. These could create bonds between spouses. The letters and personal writings that bond survive from medieval times show that some couples did genuinely love each other and grieved deeply when separated by distance or by death. However, these loving marriages existed within the same framework of male authority and female subordination that characterized all marriages. A wife might love her husband, but she was still subject to his authority and still had limited autonomy. A husband might love his wife, but he still had the legal right to control her, to discipline her, and to make all major decisions for the family. Love did not change the fundamental power imbalance of the relationship. The emotional loves of medieval people were not necessarily less rich or complex than pulsine, those of modern people, but they were expressed and experienced differently. The intense focus on romantic love that characterizes modern culture, the idea that finding one's soulmate is the key to happiness, the emphasis on passion and emotional fulfillment, all of these would have seemed strange and even dangerous to medieval people. They valued duty, stability, and the fulfillment of social roles over personal emotional satisfaction. For a modern person, the medieval understanding of love and romance would feel cold and constrained. The idea that romantic love was separate from marriage, that marriages should be based on practical considerations rather than on emotional connection, that expressions of passion were dangerous and should be controlled. All of these attitudes would be alien and distressing. The inability to freely pursue romantic relationships, to follow one's heart, to prioritize emotional compatibility in choosing a spouse, would make the medieval experience of courtship feel empty and unsatisfying. And yet, medieval people did form meaningful relationships, did experience love and loss, did care deeply about their spouses and children. Their emotional lives were shaped by different expectations and different social structures, but they were still fully human. Understanding their experience helps us appreciate both how much has changed in terms of personal freedom and romantic expression, and how some fundamental human experiences, including the desire for connection and for love, transcend the particular social forms they take. The medieval person approaching marriage would not be seeking a romantic partner in the modern sense, but rather would be accepting a social role and a set of responsibilities. They would hope for a spouse who would fulfill their duties competently, who would not be cruel or abusive, and with whom they might develop some degree of affection and respect over time. This pragmatic approach to marriage, while foreign to modern sensibilities, was adapted to the born realities of medieval life, where survival and social stability took precedence over personal happiness. Chapter 8, Conclusion and Busemal, Final Reflections. As we conclude this extensive examination of what dating or courtship was like in medieval times, we must reflect on the profound differences between the medieval experience and modern expectations of romantic relationships. Every aspect of medieval courtship, from the first awareness of potential matches to the wedding night and into married life, would be alien and difficult for a modern person to endure. The absence of personal choice stands out as perhaps the most significant difference. Modern people take for granted the freedom to choose their own romantic partners, to date multiple people before settling down, to break off relationships that are not working, and to prioritize personal happiness and compatibility in making decisions about marriage. In medieval times, none of these freedoms existed. Your spouse would be chosen by your family based on considerations that had little to do with your personal preferences or emotional needs. The lack of opportunity to develop emotional intimacy before marriage would be another major challenge. Modern relationships typically develop over time, with couples spending significant time together, talking, sharing experiences, and gradually building trust and affection before making a commitment. Medieval couples would go into marriage as strangers expected to build a life together, despite barely knowing each other. The idea that you would marry someone you had met only a handful of times and had never had a private conversation with would be terrifying. The rigid gender roles and the fundamental inequality between men and women would be deeply troubling to anyone with modern values. The expectation that women would be passive and subordinate, that they would have no say in major decisions, that they would be under male authority their entire lives, would be oppressive and dehumanizing. Even men, while having more power and freedom than women, would be constrained by rigid expectations about masculinity and by pressure to conform to social norms. The emphasis on practical considerations over emotional ones would make the entire process feel transactional and cold. Modern people expect marriage to be about love, about finding someone who completes you, about building a partnership based on mutual respect and affection. Medieval marriage was about property, social status, political alliances, and producing legitimate heirs. Romance, if it developed at all, was incidental to these primary purposes. The social pressure to marry and the lack of acceptable alternatives would create a sense of being trapped. Modern people can choose to remain single, to focus on career or other pursuits, to take their time finding the right partner. Medieval people had no such luxury. Marriage was expected, often at a young age, and refusing to marry would result in social marginalization and economic hardship. Yet, despite all these difficulties and constraints, medieval people did marry, did form families, did build lives together. They adapted to the system they were born into because they had no other choice and because they had never known anything different. Some found happiness within the constraints of their marriages. Others endured unhappiness for the sake of duty and social obligation. Most probably experienced a mixture of both, finding meaning in their roles as parents and household managers, even if they never experienced romantic fulfillment in the modern sense. Understanding medieval courtship and marriage helps us appreciate the tremendous changes that have occurred in how relationships are formed and how marriage is understood. The development of individual choice, the recognition of women's rights and equality, the acceptance of love as the primary basis for marriage, the ability to divorce and to leave unhappy relationships, all of these represent hard-won social progress that has made modern life vastly better than medieval life in this respect. If you were somehow transported to medieval times and were expected to participate in the courtship and marriage practices of that era, you would find the experience nightmarish. The lack of freedom, the inability to express your true feelings, the pressure to accept an arranged marriage with someone you did not know or love, the rigid social roles, the emphasis on duty over happiness, all of these would clash violently with your modern values and expectations. You would chafe at the restrictions on your movements and interactions. You would resent the authority that parents and society exercised over your personal life. You would be horrified at the prospect of marrying a stranger chosen for you by others. You would struggle with the gender inequality and with the power imbalances built into every relationship. And you would desperately miss the freedom to pursue relationships based on mutual attraction, emotional connection, and genuine choice. As you drift off to sleep tonight, secure in your freedom to choose your own path in romantic relationships, whether that means dating casually, seeking a long-term partner, remaining single by choice, or any other option that suits you. Take a moment to appreciate this freedom. The medieval world of arranged marriages, rigid social hierarchies, and subordination of individual desires to family interests is behind us, and we need never experience it. Modern relationships have their own challenges, certainly. The freedom to choose can be overwhelming. The emphasis on finding perfect compatibility can create unrealistic expectations, The ability to easily leave relationships can make commitment harder. But these modern problems, real as they are infinitely preferable to the constraints and difficulties of medieval courtship. Sleep well, dear listener, knowing that you live in a time when love and personal choice matter, when individuals can shape their own romantic destinies, and when marriage is a partnership entered into freely by two people who care for each other, rather than a transaction arranged by families for economic and social purposes. The world has changed dramatically for the better in this respect, and we should be grateful for the progress that has been made. Chapter 9. The legal and financial framework of marriage arrangements. To fully understand medieval courtship and marriage, we must examine in detail the legal and financial structures that governed these arrangements. Marriage was not simply a personal matter, but was a complex legal transaction with significant economic implications, and understanding these frameworks reveals why the process was so different from modern dating. The marriage contract was a formal legal document that would be negotiated between families before a wedding could take place. This contract would specify the financial arrangements, including the dower, and various other property considerations that would accompany the marriage. The negotiation of this contract could take weeks or even months, with lawyers or legal advisors representing the interests of each family. The dowry was the property or money that the bride's family would provide to the groom or to the married couple. The size and composition of the dowry would vary depending on the family's wealth and on the status of the marriage being contracted. A noble family marrying a daughter to another noble family might provide a dowry consisting of land, money, valuable objects like jewelry or plate, and sometimes political or military support. A merchant family might provide a dowry of cash, trade goods, or business interests. A peasant family might provide a dowry of cash, trade goods, or business interests. A peasant family might provide a dowry of livestock, household goods, or a modest sum of money. The negotiation of the dowry was a delicate process. The bride's family would want to provide enough to make the match attractive, but would not want to impoverish themselves or disadvantage other children who would also need dowries or inheritances. The groom's family would want to secure the largest possible dowry, but would need to balance this against other considerations, including the bride's family connections, the bride's personal qualities, and the political implications of the alliance. The dowry would be specified in detail in bond, the marriage contract, listing each item or sum of money and establishing when and how it would be transferred. Some portions of the dowry might be paid immediately upon betrothal, while other portions might be paid at the time of the wedding, or even in installments over subsequent years. The contract would specify what would happen to the dowry if the marriage did not take place, if one party died, or if other complications arose. The dower was the provision made for the wife's support if she became widowed. English law and the laws of many other medieval jurisdictions required that the husband or his family guarantee the widow a certain portion of the husband's property, typically 1/3, which she would control and from which she would derive income for the rest of her life. This dower right was intended to protect women from destitution if their husbands died, and it was an important consideration in marriage negotiations. The dower would also be specified in the marriage contract, detailing exactly which properties or sources of income would be assigned to the wife as her dower. The bride's family would want to ensure that adequate dower provisions were made, as they were responsible for their daughter's welfare and would not want to see her left impoverished if she were widowed. The negotiations might include discussions of what would happen if the husband died before the marriage was consummated, if the wife died before the husband, or various other contingencies. In addition to the dowry and dower, the marriage contract might address numerous other financial matters. It might specify what property the husband would bring to the marriage, what control the wife would have over her own property, what would happen to property if there were children or if there were no children, what obligations each family would have to support the married couple, and various other details. These contracts could become quite complex, particularly for wealthy families with extensive property holdings. The legal formalities required for a valid marriage changed somewhat over the medieval period and varied by jurisdiction, but certain elements were generally required. The church required that marriages be publicly announced through the reading of banns, which were formal announcements made in church on 3 successive Sundays or holy days before the wedding. The purpose of the banns was to give anyone who knew of any impediment to the marriage, such as a previous marriage or close blood relationship between the parties, an opportunity to come forward and object. The actual wedding ceremony had both religious and legal components. The exchange of vows before witnesses was the essential legal act that created the marriage, while the church blessing and the nuptial mass were the religious components. The one needed to be performed by a priest and needed to have witnesses to be fully valid, though there was some complexity around what constituted a valid marriage and whether marriages contracted without all the proper formalities could still be considered binding. After the wedding, the marriage would be recorded in church records and sometimes in civil records as well. This documentation was important for establishing the legitimacy of children born to the couple and for resolving any future disputes about property, inheritance, or the validity of the marriage itself. The legal status of married women was significantly constrained compared to unmarried women or widows. Upon marriage, a woman would come under the legal authority of her husband in a relationship called coverture. Under coverture, the wife's legal identity was essentially merged with her husband's, and she could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts, could not sue or be sued, and could not make legal decisions without her husband's consent. This legal subordination meant that the wife was entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill and management. If the husband was responsible and fair, the wife would be protected and provided for. If the husband was irresponsible and fair, the wife would be protected and provided for. If the husband was irresponsible, abusive, or dishonest, the wife would have little recourse. The law assumed that the husband would act in the best interests of his wife and family. But this assumption was not always justified. The legal framework also addressed what would happen if marriages failed or if disputes arose. Divorce, in the modern sense, was not available in medieval Catholic Europe, as the Church taught that marriage was indissoluble. However, marriages could be annulled if they were found to have been invalid from the beginning due to impediments such as consanguinity, a previous marriage that had not been dissolved, impotence, or lack of proper consent. Obtaining an annulment required petitioning church courts and proving that one fee canov of the recognized impediments existed. This process could be expensive and time-consuming, and it was more readily available to wealthy and powerful individuals who could afford the costs and who might have influence with church authorities. Common people who were trapped in unhappy marriages would have little realistic hope of obtaining annulments. Separation from bed and board was another option that church courts might grant in cases of extreme cruelty, adultery, or other serious problems. This separation would allow the couple to live apart and would relieve the wife of the obligation to cohabit with an abusive husband, but it would not dissolve the marriage and would not allow either party to remarry. The joint separated couple would remain legally married, and their property would remain subject to the marriage contract. The legal and financial complexity of medieval marriage meant that courtship was never simply about two people falling in love and deciding to marry. It was always also about property, about family interests, about legal obligations, and about economic security. The romantic and personal aspects of courtship, to the extent they existed at all, were subordinated to these practical and legal considerations. Understanding this legal and financial framework helps us see why families were so involved in arranging marriages and why individual preferences were given so little weight. Marriage was too important as a legal and economic institution to be left to the emotional whims of young people. The stakes were too high, the consequences too lasting, and the complexity too great for decisions to be made based on attraction or feelings. Chapter 10: Case Studies of Medieval Courtships. To make the abstract principles we have discussed more concrete, let us examine several hypothetical but realistic case studies of medieval courtships, showing how the process would unfold in different social contexts and for different types of people. These detailed examples will illustrate the variety of medieval courtship experiences while reinforcing the common themes we have identified. Case Study 1: The Noble Marriage Alliance. Lady Eleanor is 13 years old, the daughter of an earl whose lands lie in the north of England. Her father has been negotiating with the Duke of Lancaster about a marriage between Eleanor and the Duke's second son, Sir Thomas, who is 26 years old. The negotiations have been ongoing for 6 months and have involved extensive discussion of the dowry, the dower provisions, and the political alliance that would be formed by the marriage. Eleanor has been told that she will marry Sir Thomas, but she has never met him and knows very little about him beyond what her father has told her, which is mainly information about his military accomplishments and his position in the Duke's household. Eleanor is frightened by the prospect of marriage to a man so much older than herself, and by the idea of leaving her family to live in a distant region where she knows no one. The marriage contract is finally agreed upon, specifying that Eleanor's father will provide a dowry consisting of 2 manors with their associated lands and rents, 500 marks in cash, and various valuable items including silver plate and jewelry. In return, the Duke guarantees that Eleanor will receive a dower of 1/3 of Sir Thomas's properties if she is widowed, and also promises that Eleanor will be treated with respect and dignity as befits her rank. The betrothal ceremony is arranged and takes place at Eleanor's father's castle. Sir Thomas travels north with a retinue for the occasion, and Eleanor sees him for the first time at the betrothal feast the evening before the ceremony. She finds him intimidating, as he is tall and rough in manner and speaks to her father about military and political matters that she does not understand. He barely looks at her during the feast and addresses only a few formal words to her. The betrothal ceremony the next day is conducted according to proper form, with a priest presiding and many witnesses present from both families. Eleanor and Thomas exchange promises to marry, and rings are exchanged as symbols of their commitment. Eleanor speaks her part in a quiet, trembling voice, keeping her eyes downcast as she has been instructed. Thomas speaks his part in a loud, firm voice that suggests confidence and authority. After the betrothal, Thomas returns to his father's lands, and Eleanor remains with her family for the 6 months before the wedding will take place. During this time, she sees Thomas only twice, at formal visits where they are never alone together, and where conversation is limited to polite formalities. Eleanor spends this time being instructed by her mother and by the women of the household in the duties she will have as a married woman, and she prepares the items she will take with her to her new home. The wedding takes place at the Duke's principal castle, requiring Eleanor and her family to travel south for the occasion. The ceremony is elaborate, with many noble guests attending to the alliance between the families. Eleanor is dressed in an expensive gown of silk and velvet, with her hair elaborately styled and adorned with jewels. She looks beautiful but feels terrified as she speaks her wedding vows. The wedding feast lasts for hours, with many courses of food and much drinking and celebration. As evening approaches, Eleanor becomes increasingly anxious about the wedding night, having been given only vague and frightening information about what will happen. When the time comes for her to be escorted to the bridal chamber, she is trembling and pale. The consummation is uncomfortable and frightening for Eleanor, as Thomas is experienced while she knows nothing, and he is not particularly gentle or patient with her fear. The early months of the marriage are difficult for Eleanor. She is in a strange place, surrounded by people she does not know, married to a man who is essentially a stranger and who has little interest in her beyond her fulfillment of wifely duties. She is homesick and lonely, missing her family and her childhood home. Over time, she gradually adapts to her situation and develops a working relationship with Thomas, though they never develop what would be considered romantic love. When Eleanor becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, her position in the household improves as she has fulfilled her primary function of producing an heir. Case study 2. The merchant match. William is a 22-year-old merchant's son in London, and his father is seeking a bride for him from among the daughters of other merchant families. William's father has identified several possible matches and has begun discreet inquiries to determine which family might be most interested in forming an alliance through marriage. One promising possibility is Margaret, the 16-year-old daughter of a cloth merchant who has trade connections that would be valuable to William's father's business. William's father and Margaret's father meet several times to discuss the possibility of a match, and they find that their businesses are complementary and that an alliance would benefit both families. The fathers agree to allow William and Margaret to meet under appropriate supervision to see if there are any strong objections from either young person. This meeting takes place at Margaret's father's house, with both sets of parents present and with the couple allowed to speak with each other briefly in a corner of the room while still being observed. William finds Margaret attractive and pleasant in manner, and he has no objections to the match. Margaret finds William acceptable, though she is nervous about leaving her family and about the responsibilities of marriage. Neither young person is asked if they love each other or if they feel a strong attraction, as these are not considered relevant questions. The important matters are whether they can tolerate each other and whether the families are satisfied with the economic arrangements. The negotiations proceed to determining the dowry and other financial arrangements. Margaret's father agrees to provide a dowry of £100 in cash to transfer certain trade contracts to William's family business and to give Margaret household goods and personal items valued at £20. William's father agrees to take William into the business as a full partner upon marriage and to provide the couple with a house and an income sufficient to maintain a household appropriate to their station. The betrothal takes place 3 months after the initial meeting, and the wedding is scheduled for 2 months after that. During the betrothal period, William and Margaret see each other perhaps half a dozen times, always in the presence of family members. They have a few brief conversations in which they discuss practical matters about their future household, but they do not develop any deep emotional connection. The wedding is a modest affair compared to a noble wedding, but it is still a significant event with a church ceremony, followed by a feast for family, friends, and business associates. The marriage is consummated that night, and while Margaret finds it uncomfortable and somewhat unpleasant, it is not as traumatic as it might have been, as William makes some effort to be kind to her. The early years of the marriage are characterized by practical cooperation rather than by romantic love. William and Margaret work together to establish their household, to manage their resources, and eventually to raise children. They develop mutual respect and a degree of affection, though their relationship would not be considered romantic by modern standards. The marriage is judged successful by their families and by themselves because it accomplishes its intended purposes of forming a business alliance and producing children. Case study 3. The peasant courtship. John is a 19-year-old peasant who works his family's land in a village in the Midlands. He has known all the young women of the village his entire life, and over the past year he has developed a preference for Alice, the 18-year-old daughter of a neighboring farmer. Alice and John have worked together during harvest time and have seen each other at church and at village festivals, and they have smiled at each other and exchanged a few words. John tells his parents that he would like to marry Alice if a match can be arranged. His parents approve of Alice, as she is known to be a hard worker and comes from a respectable family. John's father approaches Alice's father to discuss the possibility of marriage. Alice's father is agreeable in principle, but wants to discuss the practical arrangements. The main issue to be negotiated is what the young couple will live on and how they will support themselves. John's family has a small amount of land, but not enough to divide between John and his older brother. Alice's family has slightly more land and might be able to provide a small portion as Alice's dowry. The fathers discuss whether the young couple might rent additional land from the lord, whether they might live with one family or the other until they can establish an independent household, and what resources each family can contribute. After several discussions, an end arrangement is agreed upon. Alice will bring a small dowry consisting of a cow, some household goods, and the rights to cultivate a small strip of land. John's family will provide some farming equipment and will allow the couple to live with them initially. The couple will work together to save money and resources with the goal of eventually establishing their own household, probably within 2 or 3 years. Alice is consulted about the arrangements and is asked if she is willing to marry John. She agrees, as she likes John well enough and knows that she needs to marry someone, and John seems like a good match. She is not asked if she loves him, and she would not claim to be in love, but she thinks they will be able to work well together and build a life. The betrothal is a simple affair with the families gathering at Alice's parents' home and the couple exchanging promises in front of witnesses. There is no elaborate ceremony, just the formal promises and a small celebration with ale and simple food. The wedding is scheduled for 2 months later, after the harvest, when there will be more time and resources for a celebration. During the betrothal period, Alice and John are able to see each other more frequently than they were before, though they are still never alone together without chaperones nearby. They talk about their plans for their household and their future, and they work together sometimes in the fields. They become comfortable with each other, though their relationship is based more on practical cooperation than van meer is broederlich. They talk about their plans for their household and their future, and they work together sometimes in the fields. They become comfortable with each other, though their relationship is based more on practical cooperation than on romantic feelings. The wedding takes place at the village church with most of the village attending. There is a modest feast afterward with food contributed by both families and by neighbors. The celebration is cheerful and somewhat rowdy, with much drinking and joking. The couple is escorted to their bed in John's parents' house with much teasing and crude humor about the wedding night. The early years of the marriage are hard work, as John and Alice labor together to make a living from farming and to save enough to establish their own household. They develop a solid partnership based on shared work and shared goals, and when children begin to arrive, they work together to provide for them. Their relationship lacks the romantic intensity that modern people would expect, but it is functional and becomes affectionate over time. They consider themselves fortunate to have each other and to have made what their families and community consider a good match. Chapter 11. The Betrothal Ceremony and its Significance. The betrothal ceremony was a crucial step in the medieval courtship process, and understanding its significance and its details helps us appreciate how seriously these arrangements were taken and how binding they were considered to be. Let us examine the betrothal ceremony in detail and explore its legal, social, and emotional dimensions. The betrothal was a formal, public ceremony in which a man and woman would exchange promises to marry each other. This ceremony was considered legally binding, creating an obligation that could be enforced through church courts and that could be broken only with serious consequences. The betrothal was not simply an engagement in the modern sense, where the couple has announced their intention to marry, but could change their minds without legal ramifications. Rather, it was a contract that created real obligations and that changed the legal status of the parties involved. The ceremony would typically take place with both families present, along with other witnesses, including friends, neighbors, and sometimes legal or religious officials. The presence of witnesses was important, as they could later testify about what promises had been made and what terms had been agreed upon if there were any disputes. The more important the families, the more elaborate the witness list would be. The ceremony would begin with a statement from the fathers or male guardians of the couple, explaining that they had agreed to the match and stating the terms of the agreement, including the dowry and other financial arrangements. These terms would be announced publicly so that all the witnesses would know what had been agreed and could later confirm it if necessary. This public announcement served to make the agreement transparent and to create social pressure for both families to honor their commitments. The couple would then step forward and would exchange vows, speaking words that had been prescribed by custom or by church law. The exact words would vary by region and time period, but they would generally follow a pattern where each person would promise to marry the other. The man might say something like, "I, Thomas, take you, Eleanor, as my betrothed wife," and the woman would say something similar. These words, spoken before witnesses, were what created the legal obligation. After the verbal promises were exchanged, there would be a physical token of the betrothal, usually the exchange of rings. The man would place a ring on the woman's finger, symbolizing his commitment and his future provision for her. The woman might also give a ring to the man, though this was less common. The rings would typically be simpler than wedding rings would be, as they were meant to be temporary symbols to be replaced by wedding rings at the marriage ceremony. The betrothal ring would often be worn on the left hand, but the specific finger might vary from the modern practice of wearing rings on the fourth finger. Some regions had customs of wearing betrothal rings on different fingers than wedding rings, so that one could tell at a glance whether a woman was betrothed or married. The ring served as a public signal that the woman was spoken for and that other men should not approach her with marriage proposals. After the exchange of promises and rings, there might be a blessing from a priest if one was present. Though priestly blessing was not strictly necessary for the betrothal to be valid, the gathering might then move to a celebration with food and drink served to mark the occasion. For wealthy families, this might be an elaborate feast, while for common families, it might be a simple meal shared among family and close friends. The celebration served to further publicize the arrangement and to allow the two families to begin building relationships with each other. The period between betrothal and marriage would vary in length depending on the circumstances. For young people who were considered ready to marry immediately, the period might be only a few weeks or months, just long enough to prepare for the wedding. For children who were being betrothed young, the period might be years, extending until they reached an age considered appropriate for marriage and for the consummation that would follow. During the betrothal period, the couple's relationship would change in some ways while remaining constrained in others. They would be recognized as promised to each other and would have some limited social permission to interact that they had not had before. They might be allowed to sit together at gatherings, to talk with each other in corners while still being observed, and to exchange small gifts or tokens. However, they would still be expected to avoid any private time together and would still be expected to remain chaste until marriage. The woman's virginity during the betrothal period was crucial, as the discovery that a betrothed woman had engaged in sexual activity would be grounds for the man to break the betrothal and would bring severe shame on the woman and her family. Some couples did engage in sexual relations during the betrothal period, and if pregnancy resulted, the marriage would typically be hastened to legitimize the child. However, such behavior was risky and was strongly discouraged. Breaking a betrothal was possible but was difficult and came with serious consequences. If one party wished to break the betrothal, they would need to have good cause, such as the discovery of a previous marriage, a close blood relationship that had not been known, or serious misconduct by the other party. Breaking a betrothal without adequate cause would result in legal penalties, financial costs, and severe damage to reputation that could make it difficult to arrange another marriage. If the woman's family broke the betrothal, they might be required to return any goods or money that had already been exchanged and might need to pay additional compensation to the man's family for the broken agreement. If the man's family broke the betrothal, they might be required to return any goods or money that had already been exchanged and might need to pay additional compensation to the man's family for the broken agreement. If the man's family broke the betrothal, similar penalties might apply. The church courts would hear cases involving broken betrothals and would determine whether adequate cause existed and what penalties should be imposed. The betrothal ceremony and the betrothal period served multiple functions in medieval society. They created a public record of the marriage arrangement that would help prevent disputes later. They allowed time for the practical preparations for the wedding and for the establishment of the new household. They gave the couple some opportunity, however limited, to become acquainted before marriage, and they created social and legal pressure that would ensure that the marriage would actually take place as agreed. For the young people involved, particularly for young women, the betrothal ceremony would be a momentous and probably frightening occasion. It would mark the point at which their futures became fixed, at which they knew definitively whom they would marry and when their lives would change. The ceremony would make their situation real in a way that abstract negotiations between their parents had not. After the betrothal, there would be no going back except in the most extreme circumstances, and the young person would need to accept and adapt to the future that had been arranged. Understanding the betrothal ceremony in detail helps us see that medieval courtship was not a casual or informal process, but was governed by elaborate customs and legal requirements. The betrothal was taken as seriously as the marriage itself and created binding obligations that would shape lives. The care and formality with which betrothal were conducted reflects how important marriage was in medieval society and how much was at stake in arranging these unions. As we bring this exhaustive examination to its close, let us acknowledge that medieval courtship and dating, or rather the lack of anything resembling modern dating, represented a fundamentally different approach to forming life partnerships. The modern freedom to choose one's own romantic partners, to date casually or seriously, to develop emotional connections before making commitments, to break off relationships that are not working, all of these freedoms are relatively recent developments in human history. For most of human history, including throughout the medieval period, marriage was too important as a social and economic institution to be left individual choice and romantic feelings. The medieval system of arranged marriages served the needs of medieval society, providing a mechanism for forming alliances, consolidating property, maintaining social hierarchies, and ensuring that young people married and formed households that would be economically viable. Within this system, many people found ways to build satisfying lives and meaningful relationships, even if those relationships were not based on romantic love in the modern sense. Others suffered in unhappy marriages that they had no power to change or escape. For modern people, the medieval approach to courtship and marriage would be intolerable, and we should be grateful that we live in a time when individual choice and romantic love are valued, and when we have the freedom to shape our own romantic destinies. Sleep well, dear listener, and good night.